Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Postcard from Hamburg, a World War II spy thriller by J. Toner, narrated by Gildart Jackson. Part 1. Camp 20. Chapter 1. June 1943. Secret Intelligence Services HQ, Broadway Buildings, Whitehall, London. Kurt Muller ran his eyes over the contract before signing it. By this simple act he was transformed from an Oberleutnant in the Abwehr, the military intelligence service of the Third Reich, to a humble foot soldier in the British Army, his pay 2 shillings per day. Colonel Underwood handed him a second single-page document headed Official Secrets. Kurt read it quickly, signed it, and handed it back. "You are now an enlisted member of the Intelligence Corps in the service of His Majesty George VI. Congratulations," said the colonel. He stood, holding out his hand. Kurt stood, shook the colonel's hand, and they both resumed their seats. "Could we talk about leave, Colonel? I was hoping to visit my girlfriend in Ireland. Her daughter's birthday is in a few days." "Not possible, Muller. We have a most urgent mission for you. It shouldn't take long, and after that you may have a few days' leave." Kurt bit his tongue. He dearly wanted to make it back to Dublin for Anna's 10th birthday, but there was no point arguing with the British Army. He said, "I hope you're not expecting me to return to Germany again, sir. I doubt that I'd make it out of there alive a third time." The colonel shook his head. "Nothing like that, Kurt. Our colleagues in counterintelligence have requested your assistance with their investigations. They run an establishment not far from here where they interrogate subversives and suspected German spies." He paused in mid-sentence, took off his spectacles, and polished them with a handkerchief. Bright sunlight pouring in through the high window behind the colonel made it impossible to read his expression. "What's this establishment called?" Kurt asked. "They call it Camp 20. It's run by Lieutenant Colonel Stevens." Kurt was not familiar with either name. Underwood put his glasses back on his nose, tucking the metal arms behind his ears one by one. "Unearthing Nazi spies is an uncertain business. Stevens needs our help, your help, to decide whether certain individuals who claim to be innocent civilians may actually be enemy agents. The hope is that you will be able to identify some of these from your time with the Abwehr." "But it's a year since I worked for the Abwehr." "Quite. The colonel knows that, which is why he wants you to pose as a suspect, and he wants me to spy on the other prisoners." "Not to put a fine point on it, yes. The plan is to send you in there as a suspect, let you mix with your countrymen, shake the bushes, so to speak, and see what comes tumbling out." "How long will I have to stay in there?" Colonel Underwood lifted a bony shoulder. "Colonel Stevens will decide when to let you go." He waved a dismissive hand and turned his attention to the papers on his desk. "Talk to Major Faulkner about an alias and a cover story." Kurt found Erica Cleesby, his companion from their last mission, nursing a cup of tea in the empty canteen. She'd had her hair cut short, almost like a man's, and swept away from her face. It was an extraordinary transformation that accentuated her hazel eyes and full lips. He took a cup of ersatz coffee to the table and sat beside her. "You look great, Erica. That's an interesting new hairstyle." He took a sip of his drink and pulled a face. "Hello, Kurt. Do you like it?" She patted her hair. "It's the latest fashion in Paris, so I'm told." "It's beautiful. When are you leaving?" He'd heard a rumor that she was to be posted to France. Half Swedish, half Canadian, Erica was fluent in at least 4 languages that he knew of, including French. "Any day now. What about you?" "I've been given a short assignment in London. Colonel Underwood has promised me some leave when it's finished. I'm hoping to get home to my family." "How is Gudrun? Have you heard from her? Where is she?" "She's still in Dublin with my mother. She doesn't know where I am." "And Anna? How old is she now?" "She's nearly 10. "I thought your mother had a telephone." "She does, but it doesn't seem to be working any more. You should write her a letter." Kurt made no reply to that. He had been meaning to write, but somehow never found the time. He asked Erica where she was billeted. There were no women residents at SIS headquarters. "A small hotel on Bayswater Road, for another week anyhow, until I leave for France," she replied. "This is your cover story, Kurt. Read it, memorize it, and throw it away." Major Faulkner handed over a folder. Kurt flipped it open. "So I'll be posing as this Aldous Drexler?" "Aldous Drexler is your alias. You will arrive at Camp 20 with an obviously false identity card and nothing else. For the purposes of this exercise, Aldous Drexler is the only name you will admit to for the duration of the exercise." "Even among the prisoners?" "Even among the prisoners, you are Aldous Drexler, unless someone recognizes you." "Then what?" "Improvise. Get into the mental state of an Abwehr agent behind enemy lines, and behave accordingly. Like an actor. No, this is not acting. You need to believe that you are an Abwehr agent concealing vital information from your jailers. And be warned." Major Faulkner writhed in his seat. Kurt had never seen him so unnerved. "Lieutenant Colonel Stevens has a certain reputation." Kurt knew what that meant. His innards churned. "What if I refuse?" The Major fixed him with his gaze. "That's not an option, Kurt. As a member of His Majesty's Armed Forces, you are obliged to follow a direct order." Chapter 2. Wearing handcuffs and escorted by an armed Tommy, Kurt was delivered in an army truck to Camp 20 in Latchmere Road, 40 minutes bone-shaking drive from SIS headquarters. He was instantly dismayed by the sight of the building, a dilapidated 3-story mansion standing in its own grounds, surrounded on all sides by 2 rings of cheerless 10-foot-high barbed wire fence. A sentry guarded the only entrance. The Tommy marched Kurt inside, released him to a look-alike, and departed. 2 guards frog-marched him into a room with bare floorboards and no furniture. The place had the disinfectant reek of a hospital, but with a layer of terror and body odours. They removed the handcuffs and ordered him to strip. Kurt removed his clothes. One of the guards clicked his fingers. "And the watch?" Kurt removed his watch and handed it over. The guards gave him a threadbare shirt in duck-egg blue, a matching pair of wafer-thin trousers, and light shoes with no laces. "What about underwear?" he asked. "No talking," said one guard. "Sprechen verboten," said the other one in a comic German accent, spraying Kurt's face with spittle. Kurt put on the clothes. The pants barely reached his shins. They led him down a bare corridor to another room, opened the door without knocking, and pushed him inside. A stern-faced man in a uniform of an officer sat behind a desk. Kurt assumed this must be Lieutenant Colonel Stevens. The guard stood at the door. Kurt remained standing. There was nowhere to sit. "Herr Aldous Drexler, where do you come from?" Stevens spoke in flawless German, his accent difficult to place. Kurt replied in German, "I'm from Munich." His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, 8 hours earlier. Stevens peered at him through a monocle that appeared welded to his right eye. "When and why did you arrive on British soil?" "I have been here since early 1939. I was on a student exchange when the war broke out. I couldn't get home." The colonel's lip curled in a sneer. "Ah, the student exchange. If I had a pfennig for every time I've heard that yarn, I would be a very rich man. You'd be well advised to come up with something more original than that when you speak to my men." Kurt watched as Stevens's jaw moved. He was grinding his molars. Either that or he had saved some titbits from his last meal. Kurt did his best to suppress a smile. "You find something amusing?" Kurt shook his head. Nothing. It was a passing thought. "Share it with us." Kurt assembled a plausible story as he spoke. "You remind me of an uncle of mine, a shoemaker from Wiesbaden. How do I remind you of him? Stevens glared at Kurt. He wore an eyeglass like yours. You find my eyeglass amusing? Not at all, sir, said Kurt, his stomach disagreeing with him loudly. The Tommy by the door cleared his throat. Leave us, said the colonel, and the guard left the room. Stevens waited until the door was closed, then continued in a moderated tone. I hope Colonel Underwood has explained your purpose here. The prisoners in Camp 20 are all known or suspected enemy agents. Our task is to extract the maximum amount of information from them in the minimum time. We are particularly interested in their methods of communicating with their handlers in Germany. Your job is to infiltrate and gather information. If you recognize anyone, you must let me know immediately. Do you understand? Yes, sir. It will be vital to maintain the fiction, said Stevens. As long as the prisoners think of you as one of their own, they will be unguarded in what they say in your presence. If the prisoners suspect for a moment that you're working for us, you will learn nothing, and it's quite possible they may kill you. For this reason, none of my men have been told who you really are. As far as they know, you are just another enemy agent, and you will be treated accordingly. Is that clear? Kurt shivered. Yes, Colonel. We shall talk again. Stevens strode to the door and opened it. Guard, bring this prisoner to his dormitory. The guard came in and escorted Kurt from the colonel's office. Kurt wasn't certain what he had expected, but the short interview had been a strange, surreal experience. The colonel's message was clear. He was in for a rough passage. His guard took him to the top floor. As they climbed the stairs, Kurt caught distant echoing sounds of muffled screams and men shouting. The guard unlocked a door and bundled him inside. Kurt stumbled forward and found himself in a foul-smelling room with 3 prisoners, all 3 seated on their cots. The door slammed shut, and the key turned in the lock. The window was boarded up, and the air in the room was foul. A naked bulb hanging from the ceiling provided the only light. Kurt quickly identified an open bucket in a corner behind a door as the origin of the stench. "Welcome to Camp 20. I'm Hubert," said the man to his left in guttural German. "What time is it?" said the man to his right. "I arrived at about 2 p.m. It must be close to 3, Kurt replied. "What news from the war?" said the third prisoner. Kurt replied, "We lost Tunisia last month, and the Luftwaffe shot down a civilian airliner over the Bay of Biscay. There was a rumor that Winston Churchill was on board." "But he wasn't," Kurt said. "He spoke on the radio a couple of days later." "A pity," said the third man. "I'm Boris. This is Simon." Kurt nodded to each man. "I'm Aldous." "Have you met Tin Eye yet?" said Hubert. "Tin Eye?" "Oberstleutnant Stevens." He made a circle with his fingers and placed it over one eye. "Briefly," said Kurt. "He seemed like a typical British tin-pot dictator, all bluster and no steel." Boris laughed. "That's Tin Eye. He's not the worst of them." "Watch out for Cartwright. Be careful what you say to him. He's a tricky bastard," said Simon. "How will I know him?" said Kurt. Boris said, "You'll know him when you meet him. He's short and fat." "Look for a beer cask on legs," said Hubert. "He's a bastard," Simon repeated, shaking his head. "When do we get fed?" said Kurt. The 3 men laughed in unison. "After dark, if we're lucky." Chapter 3. After dark was an amorphous concept. With no daylight to measure the passage of time, it dragged by. Kurt attempted conversation with his fellow prisoners. Other than providing their birthplaces, the names of their wives, and ages of their children, their responses were short and uninformative, and he soon gave up. Mindful of his mission, he examined their faces. He recognized none of them. All 3 looked older than their years, pale-faced and suffering from varying degrees of hair loss. They all had poor teeth, and Kurt was alarmed by how thin they were, their legs like sticks and fingers like gnarled twigs. Hubert was tall, Kurt estimated 1 meter 94. Boris was the youngest and had more hair than the others. Simon had a permanent runny nose. Simon stood up, shuffled across the cell, dropped his trousers, and squatted over the bucket. "Forgive me," he said, sniffing loudly. When he had finished, he returned to his place. With a rattle of key in lock, the door swung open, and they all got to their feet. 2 Tommies led them to a large open room on the ground floor, with rough wooden tables and benches occupied by a rag-tag collection of prisoners, all dressed in the standard uniform. The first thing that struck Kurt was the lack of noise. Nobody spoke. It was like the refectory of a silent monastic order. Obviously, speaking was verboten here. He counted 23 men, including the 3 he'd spent the afternoon with. Running his eyes over the faces he could see, he spotted one that was vaguely familiar, a man in his early 50s with the physique of an aging prize-fighter, close-shaved hair and pale blonde eyebrows. Kurt couldn't put a name to the face, nor recall where he had seen him before. They sat at one of the tables, and every man in the room was given a spoon, a bowl of broth, and a thin slice of bread. Kurt tucked in. The broth was lukewarm. It tasted of cabbage with traces of onion. As he reached the bottom of the bowl, he found hard lumps the size of nail clippings that might have been pieces of carrot or turnip. They might have been nail clippings, but he used his bread to mop up every morsel. When he'd finished, he looked up to discover that few of the other prisoners had finished eating. He ran his eyes over the prisoners again, but recognized no one else. Through the windows he could see that it was well after dark. Being midsummer, it must have been 11 p.m. or later, he guessed. Late in the day for a meal. The soup was a passable first course, although a bit watery. Kurt wondered what the main course would be. Mutton, probably. A shout from one of the guards echoed around the room. "Raus!" Everyone stood and moved toward the door. "Is that all we get?" Kurt whispered to his tall companion. "That's it," Hubert replied. "Silence! Sprechen verboten!" a guard roared. There was nothing comical about that accent. The next stop was a washroom equipped with 4 urinals and 6 filthy toilets, with no partitions between the toilet pans. The men were given 15 minutes to use the toilets and wash in cold water. After that they were marched upstairs. Kurt and his 3 companions were ushered into their sleeping quarters. The guard closed the door and locked it. Without a word, the 3 men collapsed onto their cots. Kurt did the same, pulled the thin blanket across his shoulders, and fell asleep. Chapter 4. Day 2 began with breakfast in the mess. Cold grey porridge was served with lukewarm tea, cheese, and bread. A murmur of voices told Kurt that the men were permitted to speak. He sat beside the one man in the room that he had thought he recognized. He introduced himself. "Aldous Drexler." "This is not your table," said the man. He was much like the rest of the prisoners, thin, pasty-faced, and balding. His biceps were impressive, but his stomach muscles had begun to sag with age. There was something about the turn of his mouth that Kurt found tantalizingly familiar. "I'm sorry," said Kurt. "I thought I knew you." "You were mistaken," said the man. "This is not your table." "I'm sure we've met before. In Berlin, perhaps?" The man resumed his conversation with the prisoner across the table. Kurt racked his brain, trying to imagine what the man would have looked like in his prime and dressed in a Wehrmacht uniform. The man's voice was familiar, too. Kurt said, "Perhaps we met on basic training. Where did you do your initial training?" The man turned to Kurt. He lowered his voice. "Go back to your own table, Muller. We are not acquainted." Carrying his food, Kurt returned to the 3 men of his set, a ripple of adrenaline running through his body. The man knew his real name. As he ate, he continued to search his brain for a memory of where they had met. All he came up with was a vague thought that the man's family name was something short, beginning with the letter B, something like Beck, Baum, Bach. Not likely. After breakfast, Kurt was taken to an interview room for interrogation. The questions were delivered in German by a lanky individual dressed as a corporal sitting behind a plain wooden table, while an armed soldier stood guard by the door. Kurt was forced to stand. The interrogator took him through his cover story. When he was asked where he had been living, Kurt gave the address given to him by Faulkner at SIS headquarters, 17 Hampton Gardens, Wimbledon. But the house was bombed in 1942. I've been living rough since then. On the streets? Yes, and in the underground. How did you wash and keep your clothes clean? Kurt answered as best he could. The interrogator's face gave no clue of belief or disbelief. What was the name of your landlord in Hampton Gardens? Mrs. Lydia Evans. She was killed in the bombing. Is there anyone who can verify that you lived there? Afraid not. The three people in the room felt like a crowd. The ceiling was high, but there was barely large enough floor space for the furniture. The absence of windows and the heat emanating from the uniformed soldier created a stifling atmosphere. Kurt could smell the corporal's sweat. Is your transmitter still functioning? The question was delivered in the same calm tone of voice as all the others. It would have been easy for a weary prisoner to reply yes or no without thinking. What? I don't have a transmitter. The lanky interrogator never blinked. Tell me about the student exchange. What were you studying? Mathematics. I had planned to do a postgraduate course and research in Exeter University, but I never got the chance. The subject of your research? Algebraic topologies and Riemannian geometry constructs. Riemannian? It's an active field among contemporary mathematicians. I see. But the war broke out before you could get started. Exactly. What was the name of your professor at Exeter? Gareth Rees, the first morsel of truth in the whole sorry fabrication. Why did you not choose one of the many fine universities in Germany for your studies? I got to know Rees's work in Dublin, where I obtained my primary degree. A second morsel of truth. And the name of your professor in Dublin? Stefan Hirsch. Your father's name? Walter Muller. Shit! After a long pause, the interrogator said, So your name is Aldous Muller? Aldous Muller Drexler. I prefer Aldous Drexler, said Kurt, making the most of a bad mess. My mother married again after my father died, and my stepfather gave me his name. The questioning continued through the day in 1-hour sessions with short breaks in between. Kurt was provided with water and biscuits and allowed toilet breaks whenever he requested them. His lanky interrogator never raised his voice and remained polite at all times, although the questioning was repetitive, covering the same ground over and over again, with the occasional rogue question tossed in every so often in an attempt to trip him up. In the afternoon the prisoners were permitted 30 minutes in an exercise yard in groups of 10. Kurt checked the faces of the men in the yard, but Beck or Baum, or whatever his name, was not among them, and he recognized no one else. Once the exercise period was over, Kurt was taken back to an interview room to face a further battery of questions about his parents and his childhood. They broke for the evening meal, more watery vegetable broth, and resumed again immediately afterwards. By the time he was allowed to rest, Kurt was like a wet rag. He fell onto his cot and slept. Chapter 5. On your feet, Drexler! Rouse! Rouse! Kurt awoke from a deep sleep, a Tommy shaking him by the shoulder. His first thought was that the building was on fire. He had been asleep for less than an hour. He rubbed his eyes. What's happening? What time is it? Get up! Schnell! Kurt swung his legs off the cot and got to his feet shakily. 2 Tommies grabbed him by the arms and dragged him from the room barefoot. My shoes! They marched him down the stairs and into a cell where another 2 Tommies were waiting, a beefy one sitting behind a rough wooden table, the other by the door. The room was badly lit, a single naked bulb dangling overhead, its light intensified by the thick blackout curtains. Kurt stood, swaying, trying to collect his wits. "Name?" said Beefy. "Aldous Drexler." Kurt was still half asleep. His innards groaned. "I will ask you again. What is your name?" "Drexler, Aldous Drexler." "When were you born?" "July 1st, 1913. The truth. "We have information that you are an agent of the Abwehr." Kurt repeated his cover story for the 100th time. "I was on a student exchange. I got stranded when the war started." "You expect us to believe that cock and bull story?" "It's the truth," said Kurt, inserting a squeak of outrage into his voice. "We know you were sent here to spy for the Third Reich. We shoot spies." Beefy paused. This must be Cartwright, thought Kurt. The man was less than 1.7 meters tall, his physique exactly like a beer cask with legs, and with nothing but a few miserable strands of hair on his head. "You mentioned an uncle when you spoke with the colonel. Tell me more about this uncle. Where does he live?" "In Wiesbaden." "Is he still living there?" "Yes, I believe so. I haven't seen him in several years." "How many years?" Kurt was fully awake now, but his brain was addled from fatigue. "I think I last saw him before I moved to England." "When was that?" "In July 1939. "You sure about that?" Cartwright's eyes glinted in the half-light. Kurt nodded. He was busy storing away these details in his head. "What was his name, this uncle of yours?" "Heinrich. Uncle Heinrich. He was my father's brother. Close to the truth." "Was? Didn't you say he was alive?" "To the best of my knowledge," said Kurt, "but my father is dead." "When did he die?" "In July 1934. The truth." Cartwright switched to English suddenly. "Tell me about your mother." "She is Irish. The truth." "You learnt your English from her. Shouldn't you have an Irish accent?" Kurt gave a small laugh. "I do have an Irish accent." Cartwright grunted. "What did your father do?" "He worked in local government, in urban planning." "And your stepfather, this Drexler?" Kurt's mind went blank. The lanky interrogator had covered all this, but he couldn't recall what he'd said his fictional stepfather did for a living. He said, "Yes, his name was Drexler." Luckily, Cartwright changed tack. "You say you were a postgraduate student when the war started. What were you studying and in what university?" "Mathematics, true. In Exeter." "A lie." "Your professor?" Kurt was stumped by this question. He remembered answering it when the lanky interrogator asked that question, but he was rocking with sleep. "I'm sorry, I can't recall his name." "Why not?" "I'm tired. I've been questioned for hours, and I've had no sleep." "Tell me about your uncle again. What was his name?" "Heinrich Drexler." The interrogator paused. "Heinrich Drexler? Shouldn't that be Heinrich Muller? You did say your father's name was Walter Muller." "Shit. Yes, sorry. You're right, of course. Heinrich Muller was his name." "What sort of shoes did he make?" "Boots, I think. I'm not sure." "He was your favourite uncle, a shoemaker? Are you telling me he never made you a pair of shoes?" "Never." "That is strange. How far is Wiesbaden from Munich?" "I'm not sure. 200 kilometres. We hardly ever visited him." "Never." "And yet you remember his eyeglass?" Kurt's innards growled again. "Look, I was a child." "You say you studied in Exeter University," said Cartwright. "I intended to do postgraduate work and research there, but I never enrolled." Kurt was sure that was his cover story, but he couldn't recall why he'd never enrolled. "And yet you cannot recall the name of the professor there?" "His name escapes me. I'm exhausted." An hour later, after continuous questioning, Cartwright switched back to German. His voice rose a semitone. "I believe your name is Muller. Aldous Drexler is clearly an alias. What is your given name?" "My name is Aldous Muller Drexler," said Kurt. Cold sweat trickled under his arms. "This student exchange story is a load of horse feathers," said Cartwright. "Admit it, and we can all go and get some sleep." Kurt shook his head. "I can't admit—"
Sample complete. Ready to continue?